Fresh air. Hi, and welcome to episode 4 of our Fresh Ears mini-series, recorded here at Campaign's Media 360 in Brighton. I'm Neil Cowling, the founder of Fresh Air. With so many fantastic speakers and brand leaders on site, we grabbed a selection of the very best to speak to Michaela Hallam, Fresh Air's Director of Content. Today's episode is a conversation with Liam Dolan, the Head of Digital Strategic Partnerships at Sky Media. With Sky increasingly rolling out podcasts as accompaniments to their TV shows, as well as standalone content, Michaela began by asking how podcasts can straddle both commercial and editorial strategies.
The best part of podcasts is, for me, it's when you have that longer conversation. They're a longer form piece of media and people sit around and expect to be spoken to for an extended period of time, unlike pretty much every other medium where it's sort of social media is sort of 3 to 5 seconds. So the interesting thing for podcasts for me is the fact that you also have talent and the hosts that are actually featuring on stage and people are listening to. They're kind of talking about the brands through sort of things like host reads as well and engaging with them. And I think the combination of that sort of longer form, sort of lean back listen combined with the fact that it is talent talking just drives a much stronger brand connection as well. And when you get the right partnerships with the right podcast with the right brands, that can drive outside results for, you know, I don't think podcasts need to be hundreds of thousands of listens. I think it's a very engaged community.
It's so refreshing to hear you say that.
Yeah,
they do something different, don't they, in terms of if you speak to enough of the right audience, then that's the box ticked.
I think this is a funny comparison, but if you look at TikTok and podcasts, the one thing I think they share in common, even though completely different experience, is finding niches and people finding their community within them as well and feeling part of something which they didn't know existed otherwise.
It's absolutely that. It's that community sense, I think, which is why, starting with the idea of companion podcasting, it's increasing and building on the community and giving more of an experience to an audience who already like the existing content you've got. It feels like there are almost 2 strands here. There's the companion podcast, and then there's the sponsorship piece where other brands can get into the halo of the content that you're creating. Can you talk a little bit more about those 2 different strands and how they work at Sky?
Yeah, definitely. We're doing it more so within our entertainment space. I think doing it in sport is something we've done historically. We do it incredibly well. Gary Neville podcast, you'll watch the sort of Super Sunday match, and then Gary will be on air for a bit and then come off and record his podcast. So you get that immediacy. I think in the entertainment space, actually, probably not something Sky have necessarily done, but Game of Thrones, I think, was the first podcast or first show where everyone created podcasts around it. It was almost the Super Bowl for podcast companies as well. So I think that was really interesting and fascinating to see that actually people would go and watch the show and then listen to the analysis of it afterwards. And I think it's that building that community around programming, and podcasts do that more effectively than I would say pretty much any other medium. So that serves a purpose, and in a sense it also drives back to kind of increasing sort of listener or viewership of TV programming and increasing awareness as well, building a sense of community. So you're kind of repeating that customer later. So I think it serves a different purpose, but the podcast itself, one, fuels our programming on television and on social space, but then also kind of builds a community around it and creates an environment for brands to engage audiences in their own right as well.
So do brands, do you think, actually understand that podcasts or feel like podcasts are a natural part of Sky's portfolio? Or is that something you feel like there's a bit of an education piece to do?
It's definitely an education piece, yeah. It's something we've done in a mixed bag, and we've had some amazing successes. What we're looking at doing at the minute, and we've spent the last 12 months doing, is really refining that strategy and looking at where we can deliver the best results. I think it's becoming an increasingly cluttered space, so it's really making sure that we're creating the right podcast and the right programming where we're leveraging our strengths as a business, whether it's sort of access to talent or using podcasts as a route to generate and find new diverse talent and voices as well. So it's very much an education piece at the minute, kind of trying to go around even within our own sort of business as well, and talking through kind of what kind of purpose podcasts serve, how can brands get involved with it, and then how we distribute that content and create an audience, not just across audio and podcasts, but social and different platforms as well.
It feels very much kind of like a test and learn environment at the moment. On which point, what sort of models have you used for monetising podcasts? What's worked, what hasn't?
I think we have a partnership with Global where we monetise through host reads, partnerships and spot advertising. I think what we think works best is sponsorship. And it's a consistent approach to what we take with all media, actually, which is that we know that a brand wants to align themselves with the content first, and that's very much what we try to push. Is it's the content to start with, and then finding what audience aligns to that content, and then where do you need to engage them. And podcast is a natural extension of it. So how we will generally package something up would likely be you'd have a TV sponsorship, but then you'd have a social distribution and clips, and actually can we integrate audio into that as well. But then flipping that on its head, can we have audio as very much the front runner, and then you have everything that sits around that as well. So the podcast is its own piece of programming and entertainment in its own right.
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of evolution, if you like, of brands sponsoring content, because traditionally in the TV space, it's you have the content, it's self-contained, and then it's brought to you by brand X, Y, or Z. Whereas it feels like in the podcast space, there's much more of an organic relationship between the content itself and the brand, because they can weave themselves into that content.
Definitely, yeah.
Now, because you have such amazing talent and that talent's involved in that content, how have they reacted to the idea of A, doing podcasts, and B, doing that in partnership with a brand, where that brand is almost encroaching upon their creative space?
I think the right talent will understand the benefits, and actually that if they kind of work closely with the brands and with, I guess, sales teams to an extent as well, they can create something that's more powerful and actually elevates it and is beneficial in its own right. And actually that's true of all advertising, is when you get the right brand and the right advertiser and everyone understands their role and purpose, I think it can really elevate things. So podcasts are probably a medium where people understand the value. They know that almost they're paying their wages as such. So I think it's a sense of you understand the value that an advertiser brings, but then making sure that you're kind of leaning into it. Not all of them do it. Some of them sort of fight and resist against it, I would say. But I think, generally speaking, Sky Talent, one thing I've really found as being in the business is are always willing to have a conversation and see how they can lend their expertise to bring that advertising to life. And actually, podcast is the best medium, I would say, for bringing an advertiser into that conversation as well.
Couldn't agree more, but then I would say that.
Yeah.
Do you think there are some genres that lend themselves better to podcasting than others, or do you think they can all work?
I think for me, it's if you can find a community and an audience and something to talk about, it doesn't matter the genre. And I think really the best advertisers understand that it's finding an audience and then communicating with them in the right way, in the most effective way. I think we've found with podcasts, there's such a diverse range of content out there. You don't need to be, you can find your vertical. So yeah, for me, it's such a fascinating medium. I think it's something that, albeit we've been talking about for years and within the media space, and everyone understands the potential value of them, but I still don't think it's being exploited correctly. So yeah, I don't think it's a genre-specific thing as well. I think for me, it's really finding the right talent and the right audiences as well.
Something that personally really interests me in your space, especially considering what we do at Fresh Air, is how much input the brands have into the format of the podcast that's being created, because again, obviously they're paying money, they want an ROI of some kind, and so how much do they feel that they should feature in that format, and how do you kind of create the right tension whereby it's content that the audience love but that the brand feel they're getting what they need out of it?
Yeah, that's always a tension in branded content, isn't it? It doesn't matter whether it's video or audio. So yeah, it's a constant tension. I think it's about creating the right framework and having those conversations up front where people understand, what the guardrails are as such, and kind of who does what and what service, what purpose. I think for me, that's where effective briefing right at the start. I think from a sales team's perspective at Sky Media, it's making sure they're selling that understanding right from the very beginning, and then managing that throughout. And that's where, having good clients, good agencies, good sales teams, good media owners, it creates a powerful combination if everyone's on the same page with that. So yeah, it's a branded content thing, not just an audio thing, I would say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the other thing that interests me is how your sales teams feel about selling podcasts, and how that kind of journey's been for you to get them to understand what it is that they're selling in the first place, and that they need to communicate to your brands that it's not all about massive reach, but that how does that work?
Again, it's an education piece. I think most people probably listen to podcasts, so it's actually quite easy to explain this is where that piece of advertising goes, this is how the brand is woven into that. But understanding then what the metrics, how a brand wants to be woven into it, how it becomes, I think for me it's more of a partnership, the right sponsorship. Yes, you can serve audio spot ads around something, but if you want a partnership, that is a piece of branded content effectively, even if it's an existing show. So it's just making sure that they understand how that journey and that process works. I think where we found a lot of success is generally partnerships teams at agencies, particularly for sponsorships. Obviously, it makes natural sense. And as a result, I'd say from a sales team's perspective, those teams are really understanding of how branded content works, and then applying a lot of, I guess, sort of general brilliant basics, as it were, to audio and podcasts, and then just finding the nuance in it as well. But yeah, it's an education piece that we're doing, one, to tell brand or people that Sky are doing more podcasts, but also that how sales teams can go out and speak about it confidently as well, and making sure they understand kind of what program we would create. It's such a vast business. I think people are, there's so many shows that are launched. Our editorial team are doing so much amazing stuff. It's making sure that we're providing the right materials and collateral for people to really understand and know what we're doing, both internally and externally.
I mean, you've got a brilliant platform as well in terms of your owned channels and able to drive that circularity and that journey. How much do you use your TV channels to promote the audio content?
Yeah, with something we're starting to do more so. I think particularly across sport, you'll definitely see podcast trails more, and that's certainly part of our strategy. I think you're absolutely spot on. We've got so many channels that actually it should be seen as an ecosystem, and you create one piece of content here that we might create an audio show, so we've got podcasts that there's then clipped up and distributed across social, that goes around into the sort of digital platforms and our own websites, and then kind of promoted across television, and it effectively drives itself and actually creates sort of promotion marketing, but then also grows the listenership, grows the reach, drives that kind of brand awareness if a brand's part of the sponsorship as well. And that's exactly the strategy we're trying to land. So you have one piece of content that serves multiple purposes, and leveraging our own platforms and our own strengths to grow that.
The other thing that you've got, and again, from my personal background, is really interesting, is a really strong audio identity at Sky. Do you include that in all of your audio content as kind of signalling and audio cues?
I would say some programming where it's relevant, yes. You'd probably got better served speaking to our editorial teams than me, but I think for some programming you do hear that. So I think at other times it's finding the right voices and making sure that's a consistent way, and actually that's how we'll bring that to life. So whether you're used to hearing Ian King, I think that's a good example, probably Ian King, where it is a TV show, audio show, multi-platform experience, you get that consistency. I think there are other situations where if you hear the right voice and kind of what you have an affiliation with that piece of talent and that voice from a certain content and genre, you still feel that whether you're listening to a podcast or watching them on television. So I guess, yes, to an extent, it's probably an editorial conversation, but yes, I think there are some shows where we do that.
And talking about that tone of voice, you've got kind of your master brand, but then you've got your channels underneath that. So would you ever see any of those? Then they've each got quite a distinctive tone of voice that ladder up to that master brand. Would you ever see any of those channels having their own companion podcast, like Sky Atlantic, for example?
Yeah, definitely. We've got an amazing guy called Tom Pack who is really focused on podcasts in the ent space. I think we've Plot Twist already, which is one of those types of programming, but actually we're looking at creating more programming in that space as well. I think it's something we've to date not done much of, so that's definitely a focus, and it's an area where I think we can start to create more complementary audio podcasts as well that kind of really align with, say, entertainment, but then also actually understanding that just because someone's consuming a piece of entertainment programming or a Sky Atlantic show, that doesn't mean they're not a sports fan or not consuming news content as well. I think people have interests across everything, so it's how can we, again, back to leveraging our whole sort of strength, how can we tie up or join audiences from watching and listening to a podcast about the latest Sky Atlantic show through to kind of watching something or listening to something from Sky Sports and around cricket and the Ashes this summer.
Yes.
And then the same thing with news as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm also thinking about what's happening in America as to how podcasting is kind of 2 or 3 years ahead of us. Have you taken any inspiration from how other streaming services have used podcasting, so HBO or Netflix?
To an extent, for me, I think the shining example is The Ringer. I'm a big Bill Simmons fan, and I think what they created at The Ringer, where if you hear him talk about Succession, that for them is as big as the NBA Finals or the Super Bowl. And it's because they can create so much content around those sort of programming, whether it's sort of written articles or a host of different podcasts and audio, and you can cover the same piece of programming but in a number of different ways just by having different voices and talking about it in a different setting. I think for me that's the example that kind of I think content creators should be looking for. And again, it's that sort of, they're very good at using their network to promote different shows and have talent on that can talk about a number of different things, whether they're generally a sports commentator, but someone that's also then appearing on Succession shows because they love it, or talking about a TV show or a film on rewatchables as well. So I think that for me is the best example of a brand or a content creator that understands that TV programming in its own right is an event television, and can then use that to their own benefit to create content around it.
With podcasting being kind of a growing concern for you at Sky, are you creating in-house teams to create audio content, or are you bringing in outside?
A bit of both. I think which is the same true of all of our editorial content. So it is a bit of both. I would say we're looking to bring in specialists that can really guide and kind of be a leading voice, almost an exec producer, as it were, that kind of sits across that. So we've got Dave Terrace in news, we've got Jamie Hunt in sport, and then Tom Back in Ents as well, and making sure that they're across the sort of identity and the ideation and kind of the development of shows from in the first place. That should then kind of continue through into creating consistent content that sounds like Sky. And I would say, whether it's an external company making that or whether it's sort of Sky people in-house, we are building teams to do so. But I would say, again, it's very much a kind of a mix of the two.
It's really exciting to think about audio but coming back into fashion, and particularly in the form of podcasting. Final question for you. How would you define what Sky sounds like?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say probably assured, confident, but ideally impartial where relevant. If that answers it. Hopefully enough of a politician's answer I don't get in trouble.
No, it does. Thank you so much. We'll make sure that you don't miss your train. Thank you so much for your time, Liam Dolan, Head of Digital Strategic Partnerships at Sky Media.
Yes, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
A fascinating chat with Liam and a great example of a traditionally visual brand really investing in the potential of the audio world. If you'd like to find out about building podcasts and an audio strategy for your brand, we're at freshairproduction.co.uk. I'm Neil Cowling, goodbye, and thank you very much for listening.
Fresh.